Okay, this is going to be reading commentary on the David Andress book, The Terror. Um, I'm going to talk about the big questions raised by the terror and why historical theory has tried to address these questions and how they've tried to address these questions. I'm not actually going to talk that much about Andress himself or the book itself because it's very much in the line with Tackett in terms of theory. But I want to talk about the larger issues that I want you to think about while you're reading the Andress book about the terror. Okay, first of all, I mean, what was the terror? I mean, I haven't explained it yet in the lecture. I'll be talking about it on Thursday. But basically, the terror was this moment from somewhere in early 1793. Some people date it from the execution of the king in January of 1793. Some people date it later in the summer of 1793 through to the summer of 1794. So it's basically 18 months or maybe as short as a year where there was just this absolute spasm of violence. And essentially what it was that with the war on the outside, putting enormous pressure on the French government and French society, and then with all the fears about counter-revolution, and then the Vendée revolt, and then the Federalist revolt, and then the conflict between the sans-culottes and the Constitutional Convention, a lot of people in the Constitutional Convention sort of panicked and decided to carry out a massive campaign of violence to put down all these revolts. And essentially the terror had several parts. One is they revamped the legal system to make it easier and easier to accuse somebody of treason, put them on trial, and then execute them for treason. And so there were lots of judicial killings where people were run through a court trial very quickly and then executed with the guillotine. But there were also other parts of the terror. The Constitutional Convention sent out representatives on mission, which is members of the Constitutional Convention, who were given extraordinary powers and sent out into the countryside to put down revolts. And they could order mass executions and things like that, and they did. And then there were these revolutionary armies which were put together and often put at the disposal of the representatives on mission, which basically went around from region to region trying to fight the Vendée or fight the Federalist revolt, etc. And so the terror sort of had two big parts. One was the court system executing people on an individual basis, but in large numbers. And then one is this sort of mass executions that result from putting down the revolts in the Vendée or the Federalist revolt. And overall, maybe 50,000 people were killed in the course of a year in the terror, which doesn't sound big to us, after the Holocaust and what have you, but that was an enormous and shocking number for people at the time. Okay, now, and I want to point out there's been a lot of other revolutions since the French Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, all sorts of revolutions in Latin America, etc. And they often, not always, but they often have widespread violence and something approaching a terror. So the question is why do terrors happen, right? So as you're reading the Andress book, and I want you to ask yourself these big questions. I mean, one of the biggest ones that people ask over and over again is, why did the terror happen? The French Revolutionary Terror seems to be sort of the prototype for all these other terrors that come after it in Russia or wherever. So why? Why did the revolution suddenly have a need to carry out mass executions? Why was there this massive process of a machinery of death? And why did people accept all of a sudden that there would be mass executions? And why did people accept so many guillotinings in Paris, etc.? So the question is, what would cause this sudden outbreak of violence? And then what would cause the outbreak of violence to stop, right? Because it doesn't just keep going. It has a pretty, it's a pretty short-term process. And so that's one of the big questions. And underlying this, of course, is the question of, is this something that revolutions cause? Is there something intrinsic about revolutions that causes people to become violent and carry out mass murder? Right? Or, on the other hand, is it perhaps something specific, like maybe the wrong guy? Maybe it was just a freak of history that Robespierre became the head of the Committee of Public Safety, and Robespierre decided on terror. So maybe if somebody else had been in that place, if Danton had been there, we wouldn't have the terror, right? Or maybe maybe it has to do with the internal dynamics of the Constitutional Convention, and if that had gone slightly differently, we wouldn't have a terror. So the big questions are, was the terror this sort of inevitable thing? Whenever you have a revolution, you're going to have a big terror. Is it part of human nature? Are human beings just naturally violent, and when you break the rules, they get to if you throw out the rules, they suddenly say, oh, we can go do all we want and we can kill people? Or was it more a contingent series of events that led people to this final destination, which was deciding to kill thousands of people? And it didn't have to go that way. And if it had gone slightly differently, it would have gone differently. That's the big question with the terror. Underlying that, of course, is another big question, which is, what was the terror really about? Or to put it slightly differently, who was killing whom? Right? Who got chosen to be killed? Who were the people doing all the killing? And what was the rationale for what was going on? So what was the terror really about? What were they trying to accomplish by killing all these people? Who was targeted? What was the process? So it's sort of on the more detailed level, you really want to know what's happening on the granular level with the terror to understand the big question of why did it have to happen? Right? So you really have to know who's doing the killing, what's their justification, what's the mechanism they use to fight. Because then you can get into more detailed questions about, well, if this had gone differently, might they not have done that? Right? So those are the really big questions to be thinking about. And so keep those in mind as you're reading the Andress book. Okay? And there are lots of other explanations out there for the terror besides Andress. Andress was for a long time the sort of standard book on the terror. There is a new book by Tackett that just came out on the terror. I haven't read it yet, so I didn't assign it for you. But there are also, clearly Lefebvre talks about the terror in his 2-volume history, etc. So let's talk about some of these theories now of different ways people have answered those big questions. Right? The Andress is not too far off of Tackett. Now, one of the things I do want you to think about, though, is see if you can see some differences between Andress and Tackett, because they're not identical. I mean, Tackett wrote a history of the terror after Andress wrote a history of terror, because he thought he had some other things to say about it. But in general, they both tend to fall into the contingency theory. The idea that the terror was the result of a whole series of small-scale decisions and events that pushed certain people in certain directions and made them think, and every decision by somebody led to a sort of a limiting of the possibilities for other people to respond to that, and it led to other limiting possibilities, etc., until the only possibility left was the terror. So Andress and Tackett are very much focused on this person made this decision, this person was thinking this about this person, and they're really into the details, the political details of what's going on, who's making what decisions, where's the resistance coming from, etc. And they see the terror as the result of this enormous sort of dance of hundreds and thousands of people, each trying to do their own thing and making their own decisions. The net result happened to be the terror. Okay. And with Andress and Tackett, you might ask yourself, even though they're contingency theorists in the sense that each person is making decisions, I want you to think if there isn't some sort of internal logic pushing people towards the terror. Do people feel like their options are limited and they don't have the full range of decisions they could make, that the circumstances are such these are the only options they have, and so they pick one of those, and that further limits the circumstances. So I want you to think about, even if you have people making their own decisions over and over again, often people make decisions in circumstances that don't give them a full range of possibilities. Their options are limited. So think about that. Is there some sort of internal dynamic that's pushing people's decisions towards the terror in a way that could have gone differently? That's the question for Andress and Tackett. For the Marxists, it's a different question, right? The Marxists really have a larger vision of what's going on in the French Revolution, but because basically they see the French Revolution as one part of a much bigger process. And the process was basically that from the Middle Ages up until the French Revolution, French society certainly, but also European society more generally, was governed by an aristocracy who owned farmland, and the society was primarily agrarian. Most people worked as farmers. And so it was natural that the people who owned the land, which is the main source of wealth in an agrarian society, ran the society. And you know, in that time, the aristocrats and the Catholic Church structured a whole culture and a society around the idea that God wanted a social stratification, God wanted aristocrats in the top, God wanted a monarchy, you know, God wanted peasants down here, and so a whole way of justifying that social structure. But the Marxists look ahead and they say in the 19th century, you have republics break out everywhere, right? And you get the Industrial Revolution, and society shifts from being agrarian to being industrial. And by this time, the people who are really running society now are the big factory owners and the heads of corporations, the John D. Rockefellers and that sort. And so Marxists point out that, you know, you have this shift from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy. It also is a shift from an aristocracy running things along a in a monarchy to the bourgeoisie or the big factory owners running things through a republic. And so the Marxists they put the French Revolution as part of that process. And so when they look at the terror, they're basically saying, how does the terror fit into this big process whereby the bourgeoisie pushed aside the aristocracy and took control of society? Well, the Marxists actually have a sort of a double process here. On the one hand, they say the terror is simply the process of the lower classes, the bourgeoisie, the urban working poor in Paris, and the peasants, through violence, destroying the old aristocratic society. That basically the terror was a necessary stage in violence of the bourgeoisie and the urban working class getting rid of the old aristocracy. And that's the nature of a revolution. And Marxists would argue that essentially the old aristocracy is not going to give up without a fight, and so you have to use violence to get them out. Okay? And so they see the terror primarily as that, right? But there's a second process that the Marxists see happening there, because at the other end, the Marxists say, it's not the urban working class and the peasants and the bourgeoisie running society. If you look at the other end in the 19th century, it's just the bourgeoisie running society. The urban working class doesn't have a vote in the new republic. The peasants don't have a vote in the new republic. None of them have a voice in the political process. So all of those classes rise up against the aristocracy in the French Revolution, but only the bourgeoisie winds up in power at the end. So what happens in the middle? And here the Marxists say something happens in the middle where the bourgeoisie says to the urban working class and the peasants, come on, let's get rid of the aristocrats. And they all rise up and they all attack the aristocrats in the old system. But then at some point, the bourgeoisie turns around and attacks the working class and the peasants and says, no, 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 you don't get to be part of the new power now. You helped get rid of the aristocrats, but now you're done. You're out of here. Forget about it. You have nothing more to do. We're going to run things ourselves. And so the bourgeoisie is sort of elbowing the urban working class and the peasants aside. The Marxist interpretation is that is not actually, part of that is happening in the terror. You can see the beginnings of it. But that happens later with the Directory and then with Napoleon, that one of the reasons Napoleon comes along is that the bourgeoisie needs a strong leader to push the working class and the peasants back down into their place. But nonetheless, as you're reading about the terror, think about this in Marxist terms as class conflict, right? Does the terror, as Andress presents it, seem to present itself in a way that you can say, oh yeah, this is class conflict. I can see the urban working class going after, I can see the bourgeoisie going after, I can see the peasants. It's, you know, does the Marxist interpretation of class conflict map onto the facts that Andress presents to you? Right? So you might want to think about that one. And in particular, can you see in the terror, can you see a concerted effort to destroy the aristocracy and the old political structures? And then can you see an effort by the bourgeoisie to push the working class and the peasants back out of the political process and crush them and shut them down, put them back in their place, right? All right, so that's Marxism. That's the Marxist interpretation. So keep that in mind as you're reading the book, is, can I see class conflict happening here? Can I see this as this violence as part of class conflict? Does the violence of who's doing the violence to who map onto class conflict? Right? Next, the post-structuralists. Furet is obviously here. There are lots of other post-structuralists who have a lot to say about the terror also, and I didn't have you read them because there's only so much I can assign in a May term course. We're going to read Baker a little bit later in the term, and Baker has a different sort of take that you can apply to the terror. The readings we're going to do on Baker don't really apply to the terror directly. They apply to the earlier revolution, but you can use Baker and say, oh yeah, I can see how he explains the terror there. But for the post-structuralist, of course, it's all about language and culture and ideas, and like, is there a certain cultural logic that pushes people in a certain direction? It makes this seem logical and that seem not reasonable. And for Furet, the argument is really very, very simple, or very clean, if you will. Furet basically argues that there used to be an ideology or a culture of monarchy with everybody believed that social strata were normal and the aristocrats were better than everybody else and that the king should be the center of society and the king should make all the laws, etc. But all that collapses, Furet says. And it's a slow motion collapse, but basically what Furet says is over the course of the first couple of years of the revolution, there's kind of a vacuum. Nobody knows how to act. Right? Nobody knows what the key idea. They don't know how to think about political power. They don't know how to think about what the government should be doing if there's no king, if there's no aristocracy. And so what Furet says is they turn to what they know, and what they know is all these ideas that they came up with in a vacuum before the revolution, because you had all these people in salons and coffee shops, etc., writing books about political theory. None of them had any experience with actually running a government, but they wrote a bunch of nice abstract books, and Rousseau was the big one here. And so what Furet says is the revolutionaries, they get into this difficulty with the war and with revolts against the revolution, and there's the Vendée and the Federalist Revolt, etc., and they don't know how to think about it. And so they turn to Rousseau and they say, how should we think about this? And of course here, they found a language, a discourse, an interrelated set of ideas and terms and language that helped them understand what was going on. And so they used Rousseau to understand it. And Rousseau said, basically, government gets its power from the people. The people get together and they form a social contract and agree they want to have a government and they create the government. But, Rousseau said, the government must be an expression then of what he called the general will. And the general will is the will of the people. But Rousseau didn't say it happened like a vote, like 60% of the people want this, 40% don't. Rousseau said that there's sort of a magic happens. That when you have everybody being rational about what the government should do, and everybody wanting what's good for the whole group, they should all agree. And so the general will should actually include everybody. Everyone should agree on that. If everybody genuinely wants what's good for the group, and everybody is genuinely being rational about it, everybody should genuinely agree. So when these revolutionaries get into power, they think, well, I genuinely want what's good for France, and I'm being rational about this, so clearly I must represent the general will. But if that's the case, how do you explain the Girondins versus the Jacobins, right? If they're disagreeing, somebody must either not want what's good for the nation or they're not being rational, right? Because Rousseau says if you want what's good for the nation and you're being rational, you should always come to the same conclusion. And so this leads to conflict, Furet says, that basically this absolutist logic that any disagreement means somebody doesn't want what's good for the group or somebody's being irrational, leads to the obvious assumption that if there's resistance, if you want what's good for the group and you're being rational, if somebody else disagrees and there's resistance to what you're doing, it must be treason, right? And so the logic of this thought process, Furet says, pushes people like Robespierre inexorably, they're just driven by the logic of their own thought processes to say everybody who's opposing me must be a traitor, and therefore, and they're not going to listen to reason, so therefore I need to kill them, right? And so I'm oversimplifying it here. Robespierre wouldn't have said it that way, but this is the sort of logic that Furet says is inherent in Rousseau. This is right in there, and it drives people to essentially mass murder, because the only way they can make sense of, the only way they can explain why there would be massive resistance to what they're trying to do when what they're trying to do is based on what they think is the best interest of France, is that somebody doesn't like France. They must be traitors. And so there's a second part of this also that Furet goes into a little bit, which is the idea that nobody can really know what the general will is, but if you can convince enough people that you represent the general will, then people will follow you. So it basically, if power is based on the general will, then the way you get power is by convincing people you represent the general will. And so Furet says that what this actually does then is it makes power really about sort of theatrics. How good a speech can you give? How can you act like you are selfless and giving everything up for the nation? How can you act as if you aren't being in it for your own individual good? This is a sort of a theater, but it has real consequences, because the people who can play that role the best are the ones who are going to convince people they represent the general will. And Robespierre does that. Robespierre is clearly not in it for self-interest. He so clearly doesn't care about money and whatever, and he's so rigid about principles. He's clearly not corrupt. I mean, his nickname is the Incorruptible One. But it's precisely that, Furet says, which means when you get him into power, he's such a rigid thinker, he really can't think of anything to do except impose. I mean, he can't tolerate anybody sort of disagreeing or fudging or being corrupt. He just has to go after everybody, right? Because the thing that brought him to power, his ability to look incorruptible, also makes him very rigid in power, which leads him to try to commit the terror. So look for this. How accurate is Furet? Can you see in what Andress is talking about, can you see any of sort of Rousseau coming through? Can you see this sort of logic of the general will coming through? Keep an eye open for that when you're reading Andress. And just in passing, I'm going to mention some other thinkers, and I want you to think about them. One is Brinton. We read some Crane Brinton at the beginning of the course. He was talking about the preconditions for revolution. I'll just let you know that later in his book, The Anatomy of a Revolution, he talks about revolution as a sort of a fever. He talks about the terror in particular as a fever. He says that people sort of get sort of worked up into this crazed sense of unreality by the revolution, and they become more and more violent and radical. But then it's almost like a delirium that takes over society, but then it kind of breaks all of a sudden, and then the terror ends. And so Brinton sees it almost as, in psychological terms, as a sort of a psychological insanity that takes over groups of people and drives them to greater and greater violence. So you can think about that. I want to mention just two others, or rather, I really just one other, and that is that conservatives, and by conservative here I don't mean conservative Republicans like in the United States. I mean conservatives like the people who wanted a monarchy and an aristocracy before the French Revolution. Conservatives also have an interpretation for the French Revolution and the terror. And they basically say this, that most human beings, most of society, human beings are kind of violent and brutish and impulsive, and they don't think very clearly. It's only really a few people in society, usually the elites, who can see clearly, think rationally, etc. And so if you have a revolution where the elites are overthrown and the poor and the lower classes get in power, they can't control themselves. They're going to go crazy. They have so much pent-up anger and rage, and they're so irrational that violence is going to come. And so for conservatives, they see a terror. The second you challenge the established authority of the government, you're opening the door to terror, because anytime you give the lower classes power, they're going to be violent about it. And so for conservatives, it's just sort of basic human nature that human beings are prone to superstition and violence and irrational anger and things like that. And it's only social structures, the real the religion, the government, the social classes, etc. All those structures keep people in place most of the time. But if those structures break down for any reason, violence erupts, because that's human nature. So for conservatives, the terror is simply the logical outcome of putting human beings in a new position where you've destroyed the social structures that would keep them in place. Right? I just want to mention as a final closing point that when you go forward to the Russian Revolution, which basically started in 1917, the leader of the Russian Revolution, the leader of the Bolsheviks, was a guy named Vladimir Lenin. And Lenin had studied the French Revolution a lot, and he was very clear that he said terror was actually a good thing. He said, well, it was not necessarily a good thing, it was a necessary evil that served a really good purpose. Lenin basically said, if you want to have a revolution, you have to destroy the old social structure. You have to destroy the old society. You can't just say, oh, we're going to make things a little more equal. You have to completely destroy the old class system. You have to completely destroy the old government. You have to completely destroy the old economy. You have to destroy everything. Because if it still remains, people will continue to use it and it won't change. And so Lenin said, you have to have a certain amount of destruction for a revolution to be successful. And in particular, he said, the upper classes in any given society are not going to give up power and wealth and influence and status without a fight. They're going to fight you. And so what you have to do is use violence to convince them to go along with your revolution, to convince them not to oppose your revolution. And so Lenin said that, in fact, you just need to kill a certain, he said, we're trying to get rid of the old aristocracy in Russia, and we're trying to stop the bourgeoisie from taking over. We need to just kill aristocrats and bourgeois people. We don't need to kill all of them. We just need to kill enough of them to scare the hell out of all the rest of them, so they'll stop fighting us, right? And so Lenin actually said, he would tell his people, you need to kill more people. He says, I don't care if somebody's individually innocent or guilty or whatever. You just need to kill people as an example, right? You need to use terror as a tool. And Lenin said this was justified because the revolution as a whole would produce a better society and a better world and make many lives better. So you had to sacrifice some people along the way. So keep all this in mind as you're reading the Andress book, as you're thinking about the terror. Ask yourself, why did it happen? What drives this? Was it an accident of history that just a certain set of people made a certain number of decisions and it just happened to lead to the terror and it could have gone a different way easily? Or was there really an internal logic to this? Is there something about human nature? Is there something about a revolution that drives towards terror inexorably, and the people who are doing it are almost just sort of tools in the hands of history or fate or whatever? And what was it really about? Who's killing whom and why? Right? And then I want you to think about these theories. In particular, do the Marxists have a point? Do the post-structuralists have a point? Does Andress and Tackett have a point? All right, so that's how I want you to be thinking about the Andress book, and we can talk about that in the weekly conversations, the video chats on Mondays and Thursdays. So you might want to bring questions about that to those video chats if you want to. And that's it.